I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world, millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
The emperor of today is highly fashionable, but his fashion is not for courting attention. It's one of an intellectual sort. Visibility to him is a crippling notion, and thus he can't be found on newspaper headlines or any popular media source. So it falls upon us to take the initiative, for an emperor that keeps himself hidden, who schemes behind and thrives on the ignorance of his people, does not see himself as sharing the cause of his empire.
You were telling me the truth back in Baltimore, sir. Please continue now.
Everything you need to find him is right there in those pages.
And tell me how.
First, principles, Clarice. Simplicity. Read Marcus Aurelius. Of each particular thing, ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature? What does he do, this man you seek?
And though he embodies and wields the epos of the kingdom and personifies the collective, unconscious will of his people, this emperor has done what no known emperor has. He's roamed the earth's wide realms, charted the deserts in all their bushy, sandy, and oceanic forms, conquered every race of people there is, and plundered all the riches he could, and in his folly aspired to scale the heaven itself. But as the ancient Chinese maxim goes, stretch a bow to its very full, and you'll wish you had stopped in time. Temper a sword edge to its very sharpest, and you'll find that it soon grow dull. Disaster, which in Greek tragedy is the consummate of a three-part act, the first being choros, surfeit or excess, hybris, the outrageous behavior that results from being spoiled by excess, and finally, disaster, usually takes the form of an ironic denouement or ending. Parallel to these, we find the three major virtuous maxims of ancient Greece. Know thyself, nothing to excess, and certainty brings insanity, or surety brings ruin. Plato's whole corpus of dialogues imbibes these, or one can say they're a practical exposition of these tenets in the realm of thought. For example, we find that the term doxa, opinion which appears in Plato's Republic and elsewhere, approximates the idea that certainty brings insanity. Opinion has a curious tendency to propagate itself, writes Gadamer. It would always like to be the general opinion, just as the word that the Greeks have for opinion, doxa, also means the decision made by the majority in the council assembly. The famous Socratic statement, I know only that I know nothing, which we also find in the Eleatic philosopher Xenophon, who predates Socrates, is expressive of the danger of certainty. But this danger is of a different, intellectual sort. It's the hubris, conceit, and philistinism, to borrow from Matthew Arnold, that sterilizes the mind, that kills the motivation or incentive to know. Because he who thinks he knows it all, and becomes obtuse, insolent, unmotivated, and arrogantly unreceptive to further possibilities of knowledge. It's the power of opinion against which it is so hard to obtain an admission of ignorance. And since doxa, or opinion, has an epidemic tendency, the person who voraciously pursues knowledge for its sake is an epidemiologist of sorts, who perceives the stultifying danger of surety and blind consensus. And in a society where doxa rules, he's elected an iconoclast, a rogue, a guru. We'll see this motif resurface as we go along. Fortunately, our expedition in search of the Emperor's castle does not have to be physical, but not to say easier, as it will be somewhat of a Kafkaesque. In our course of finding it, we'll be forced to navigate and potentially confront the hostile buffer zones of consensus, of doxa if you will, which this Emperor has cleverly erected between himself and the rest of us. We shall not concern ourselves with the characters of the plot, but in locating and isolating the epos, the plot itself, and we'll know that we're headed the right way as our efforts increasingly come across as iconoclastic, conspiratorial, and we, trespassers. As we gain more and more ground, as we near the castle, it will seem as though we're traveling back in time, that, despite the impressive and dazzling veneer of our civilization, from democracy to industry, the forces manning this juggernaut are as old as Egypt. Our mission demands chiefly one thing, that we break out of the vernacular, the mass tongue, and to learn the Emperor's idiolect, for each class has its own language, just as studying the work of Aristotle would require acquaintance with a glossary of Aristotelian terms, or that reading Shakespeare appreciatively is impossible without a glossary of Elizabethan term. And as such, so is this Emperor's language containing a lexicon of some kind, the lexicon of imperial policies, not the decisions made on the state level, but that which transcends them. The, so to speak, policy of policies, of which these minor state-level decisions that we see and take as crucial are simply the ingredients presented in temporal succession. The imperial lexicon houses a language that is very difficult, if not impossible to translate into vernacular speech, as the mass mind, who is only accustomed to paradigmatic and consensual ideas, cannot compute such language. Individuals, however, can. Here, we ignore the mechanistic and uniform. We ignore the tedium of elections, of economy and its bogus currencies, as they're all machinery, schema, games that follow one and the same Sisyphean rhythm. We must instead go beyond that, beyond the vestige of the present, and we cannot do so through the vernacular, a language where words don't mean anything. The most valuable commodity throughout the ages has never been gold, or salt, or anything material in the conventional sense, not even land. It is the individual, and the individual person specifically. No product of nature can be considered a natural resource until man wants it for his use, and has techniques for exploiting it. Thus, rich, swampy land is not a natural resource unless man can drain it and cultivate it. The Romans assigned to the concepts of farming and education the same cultural sense, an allusion to the synonymy and essential oneness underlying the two processes, in a way acknowledging that there is something earth-like about man and man-like about the earth, as, just as cultivating a piece of land involves the seemingly contradictive practice of tillage, the disturbing, agitation, stirring and overturning of the soil, so is a person educated by an analogous procedure, tilling him with experience which makes him aware of his finitude, of his perpetual need for growth. These experiences must therefore, in the style of soil tilling, be contradictive and fundamentally negative, for every experience worthy of the name thwarts an expectation. Thus the historical nature of man essentially implies a fundamental negativity that emerges in the relation between experience and insight. The statement that man is earthbound should not be taken in the pejorative sense, as did some medieval and Renaissance philosophers, for the two, man on the earth on which he lives, are coterminous and coextensive, and any notions that the earth is insignificant, chaotic, abysmal, more so mirrors the inner state, that is, the deracinated state of the subscriber. What Arthur Lovejoy identified in The Great Chain of Being as diabolocentrism, i.e., that the earth is, In the words of Montaigne, the filth and mire of the world, the bottom story of the building, is reflective of a general pessimism, a sense of inner loss and privation and deprivation that was common at the time. As he put it, the man of that period lived in a walled town as well as a walled universe. The cosmogony of many ancient known cultures tell us in one form or another that man was fashioned from clay, or more precisely mud, and more than a simple mythical narrative of man's origin, this is an ethical formula of immense significance. Compositionally, mud is the marriage of water and dry soil, and in practice, only fertile land, that is, land that's fit for cultivation, can be tilled and harvested. By the same token, man's creation narrative is an allusion to his fertile and moldable nature, to his prolificness, his receptiveness to culture, his potential. He's fertile and potentially fruitful wherever he goes, adaptable, and the earth is his domicile and domain. He is the mobile earth. He is the earth personified. She belongs to him as much as he belongs to her. For both he and the earth are similarly constituted, that is, fertility is at the essence of their makeup. If we put this within the scope of doxa, we can somewhat see how doxa can be seen to approximate a kind of arrested growth, a stuntedness, a land gone arid, a soil that refuses to support growth. Using the simple analogy, we can easily determine what actions and large-scale systematic initiatives are fundamentally harmful and destructive. As any actions which directly affects our well-being, or the well-being of anything crawling upon the earth, can never venture too far from our simile. We find, for instance, as one of the alarming indications that humanity is headed for disaster is a staggering ratio between the farming population and the increasingly non-farming populace. The slow seizure, monopoly, and enclosure of fertile lands by phantom legal entities, and the simultaneous crowding of humanity into tight, highly surveillance cities, the depreciation and belittling of the very practice that constitutes man's universal tradition and heritage, farming, and other feudalist schemes that have been taking place for generations. It is, as Spangler put it, a problem that we're living through with hardly the remotest conception of its immensity.
And in the intervening time, you have sparked the interest of millions, literally, of children around the globe, demanding action for climate change. What's your message to world leaders today?
My message is that we'll be watching you.
Man's spiritual and genealogical bond to the land is being methodically targeted and broken under pretenses of environmental protection and preservation. The idea that's being promulgated is that man's harmful to nature, that he's destroying the environment, that this practice, his command over the environment, his homo faber, through agriculture is something that always happened at the expense of wildlife. A necessary evil, an evolutionary sine qua non and necessity that served its purpose in the wider context of Darwinian cosmology. But what it obfuscates is that man's exercising of this inalienable tradition, a tradition that's at core spiritual, has always had the complete opposite effect, promoting biodiversity and enriching the environment. With this practice, a practice that defines his very existence on Earth, he's actually the pivot, the force that spearheads the movement towards prosperity and cultural fruition, not just for his kind, but for all species. He's inseparable from it, he naturally yearns for it, it's wired into him, he seeks it out. Even technological innovation itself is essentially agricultural, albeit a devolved and ornamental form of it, a agriculture of the inanimate, if you will. Architecture, craftsmanship, art, and all other distinctly human practices are distinctly human for this reason. They are all symbolic forms and derivatives of that formal practice of farming. But this also makes them a kind of scale tipper, the thing which can make or break the whole environmental equation. Unfortunately, this latter point has become, and has been, the shaping philosophy of the emperor, the pretext under which the monstrous program of curtailing the individual is being vigorously carried out on multiple fronts. It's a program of euthanasia in every sense that's being put into practice. A program whose aim is the complete deracination of the individual from his earthly roots. But the face of this program, of course, is not as hideous as its true nature. In fact, it managed to succeed and evade detection because of the edifying mask that it strictly conducts itself under. But under this mask hides a spiteful behemoth. We see its edifying work in slogans and agitprops that call for the protection of wildlife, from people, that is, in making the world smaller than it is, poorer than it is, and human population growth parasitic.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population.
It's habituating our palates to the flavor of transhumanism.
I mean, it seemed to me some time ago that you could sort of think of humanity as a biological bootloader for digital superintelligence. For those who know what a bootloader is, a very tiny piece of code without which the computer cannot start.
That is, of not producing, if not practicing our formal heritage, and if not owning the very earth on which we live. All these are different expressions of the same policy, to deracinate, to curtail the individual, to sever that essential link between man on the earth. Cut this and man shrivels up and dies. He'll be like the fish that had washed ashore, with no hope of returning to the water, or a bird with broken wings, or a tiger with no fangs and claws, and so on. This figures in every area of life, but mainly education, or at least the modern distorted conception of it. This is the main line of attack and the last line of defense. And if we wish to understand and forecast the fate of humanity, we ought to look no further than this. And having identified the essential substance and ethos of this program, we need only follow its many generic forms and expressions, and observe its characteristic temper and mode of operation, its modus operandi, in this case, its deracinative and separative tendency, in all walks of life, and this will be the subject of the following videos.